Our first speaker this morning is Theresa Wrangham. I am honored that she's here. I've worked with Theresa. We haven't spent that much time in person together, but we've worked a lot together over the past 2 years, especially after SB 277 here in California. And just, it's an honor to have her here. She is the Executive Director for the National Vaccine Information Center, NVIC, which was founded in 1982. And is the oldest and largest consumer-led or advocating organization for the Institute of Vaccine Safety and Informed Consent for the protections of the public health system. As NVIC's Executive Director, Theresa's responsibilities include the monitoring and reporting of Federal Advisory Committee activities that shape the federal vaccine policy. She currently writes articles for the NVIC newsletter and has articles published in Mothering Magazine, Autism File, Age of Autism, and Pathways, and has been featured in local, national, international radio, TV, and news reports. And so I'm introducing Theresa. Her talk is Vaccine Recommendations, Vaccine Injury and the Law, and really covers where we came from and where we're at now. So thank you, Theresa.
Thanks. We might want to shut that off. I'm a pacer. Can you hear? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Well, this will be a challenge because I have to stay put. I'm a walker. So, as Christina said, I'm the Executive Director for the National Vaccine Information Center. And she told you a little bit about our mission. I just want to say thank you for sharing your Saturday morning with me. I know you're giving up personal time to be here. And it's an honor to be able to kick this off. You're going to have the opportunity to learn more about vaccines and other ways to detoxify your life. And there are going to be some really wonderful speakers speaking on vaccines. So I hope that this is just the beginning of you being curious and wanting more information. And I'm going to get used to using my pointer. So as Christina said, the National Vaccine Information Center is a charitable nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1982, which means we've been in business for 35 years. Our mission statement is actually, we're dedicated to preventing vaccine injuries and death through public education. As are many nonprofits, that is your main goal in a nonprofit, to impart public education. And we defend the informed consent ethic in U.S. vaccine policies and laws. The reason we take this informed consent platform is our co-founders' children were harmed by the DPT vaccine. And they were never told that vaccines could cause harm. So they felt very strongly that as parents make these decisions for their children and themselves, it's really important they're able to do this risk-benefit analysis. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you might go about doing that. What resources could you look to for that? And hopefully you're going to get to know NVIC. We're going to leave some time for your questions, too. Like any nonprofit, we tend to be a consumer watchdog. As Christina said, we're the largest and oldest consumer-led advocacy group that is concerned about informed consent protections in public health laws relating to vaccines. And I guess what I want to say to you is it's okay to ask questions. Very often in the media, asking questions on this topic it's like a sacred cow. You know, you can't do it without being accused of being pro or anti. And what I want to say to you is there are so many shades of gray in this. First off, ask yourself, just take a moment and ask yourself the question, when you buy a car, don't you want to know about the miles per gallon, how safe is the car? Many are becoming concerned about environmental toxins. We want to know that we're buying a car that isn't polluting our air. So what I do is no different with MVIC. And all we do is we put out information so that you can do that same kind of assessment. And so that's our role in the public. I got into this because of my kids, like many people who get into nonprofit work. These are my daughters, Deanna and Rachel. And I got concerned about vaccines because my mother told me that I had a pretty serious reaction to a measles vaccine back in the 60s. And it scared her a lot. And I, as a parent, when I had my children, I had concerns about, could that happen to my children? You know, what was I passing on to my children? Is this a hereditary thing? Sadly, my concerns weren't really taken very seriously, and I did go ahead and vaccinate my children, and I will tell you that my husband and I and my children all react to different vaccines. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about susceptibilities and why that might be, but it got me really interested in why wasn't that information shared with me. You know, it may not have changed my mind, but it's information I had a right to know. Okay? So that's how I got involved, and I like the platform of making my own decisions. So what we'll cover today, as Christina went over briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between a vaccine mandate and a vaccine recommendation and the vaccine landscape in general. We'll talk about what vaccine reactions and injuries can look like, and that will be brief. I really encourage you to come to our table and pick up some of our information because we have a longer list, and of course we have a website that details that greatly for you. We'll talk about the before and after the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act of 1986. That is work that our co-founders are best known for. We worked with Congress to pass this law, and it changed the vaccine landscape. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the landscape was like before that law, what that law put into place, and how it's changed over time. We'll also talk about California's laws around vaccines. And I'm going to make the assumption that you all are from California. If you're not, I'm going to encourage you to visit our website. We do keep information on each state's vaccine requirements on our website. And it's probably one of the most highly trafficked pages of our website, and it changes. I mean, I have to be very honest, it's wonderful to have volunteers when you work in a nonprofit because they help us keep our website up to date. And I want to thank Christina also for putting this together. It takes a number of people and volunteers to just make an event like this go. So as a nonprofit, we're very beholden to our volunteers who spend their time making sure our pages are up to date as well. And of course, reserving time for your questions. So let's dive in. What is the vaccine landscape? And the reason I start here is because it seems like when I talk to people or I see this covered in the media, there's a lot of confusion about who you talk to and when, if you're an activist. And the vaccine landscape unfolds really at a federal and a state level. So at a federal level, you have the Department of Health and Human Services that oversees creation, distribution, safety, and monitoring of our vaccine supply. They control vaccine policy making. Okay, they shape that policy platform. They do not make mandates. Okay, mandates happen at a state level in your state legislature. It's your state legislators that either outline in statute specifically what vaccine requirements are. And vaccine requirements, when we say we're talking about vaccine requirements, usually we're talking about school children, but I will tell you that we're seeing that for adults in different healthcare professions, if you're in a daycare situation, and we expect to see more mandates for adults. But we're going to talk a little bit more kind of in the relationship around children, okay? It's also at a state level that we see exemptions. And what you need to be aware of as you make your choices is that if for any reason you feel that a vaccine isn't a good fit for you or your child, you may have an exemption offered in your state. And there are 3 different kinds of exemptions. Whoops, did I just cut out? There's medical exemptions. Those generally come from your doctor. Well, they do come from your doctor. And they can be required to be specific about why you need the exemption, or it can just say that your doctor says this isn't a good idea. It may be for one vaccine. It may be for more. It could be a temporary or permanent. It does need to come from your doctor, though. There is religious exemption. Those are for people who have strongly held religious beliefs. It does not necessarily mean that you have to do that in the realm of a tenant of any church or organized religion. Some laws are written that way, and when they've been challenged, they've had to change their law. Okay? You can have your own personal religious belief, hold it very strongly, and that should be enough to get you that exemption. Most states offer that, and then you have what we call conscientious exemption or personal belief exemption, which is you have a personally held conviction. You know, by matters of conscience, you can't bring yourself to use one or more vaccines. Okay? So it's for that reason that when you look at state laws around vaccine requirements, whether you're talking about school children or you're talking about adults in a specific work arena, that laws differ. So what goes in my state of Colorado is different from what we see here in California. So it's important that as a consumer and as you educate yourself on this topic, that you educate yourself on what your rights are specific to your state. I was also asked to cover a little bit about the history of the schedule. And this really dovetails well when we start talking about what's the difference between a recommendation and a mandate. As I said earlier, vaccine recommendations are made at a federal level, and they're made by the Centers for Disease Control. All right. What you're seeing here is two schedules, because I was also asked to show a little history. I'm showing the 1983 schedule superimposed over today's schedule. All right. As you can see, in 1983, there were far fewer vaccines that were recommended by the CDC. Why did I pick 1983? Well, it's the earliest schedule that appears on the CDC's website right now, so if you wanted to fact check me, you could go out and it would all make sense. But basically, it was for tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, okay? And in 2017, we've tripled that schedule. You know, we've more than tripled. We're asking parents to give far more vaccines to their children from birth to age 18. And in fact, now we're actually asking pregnant women to vaccinate, okay? I will tell you that because of who we are, and when the public contacts us, I know that you've all probably seen this in the media where, you know, parents have a concern about the overall breadth of the schedule and how big it's become. But I think for a lot of us, you know, I vaccinated my children. I didn't realize it had grown. You know, when you're a child, you don't really go, oh, how many doses am I getting here? You know, it's your parents' job. So many parents are taking a step back, and they have some concerns about the breadth of the schedule as a whole. They also have a number of concerns about, for example, look how many vaccines are being given in a single visit. It's considerably more. There are some gaps now where they weren't given, and now you're getting several. Okay, so there are variations in terms of the public's concerns, and research also speaks to this. What we hear from the public is no different from when research has a look at it. These are some of the very same concerns that are found in the literature. All right. What you need to understand about vaccines is they're a pharmaceutical product, and like any pharmaceutical product, they're not risk-free. Okay. You can have a reaction, you can sustain an injury, it can be lifelong, it can be severe. And as we make these judgments around products that we take into our everyday lives, you know, am I going to eat organic, am I buying a Prius, you know, this is really no different. It's important that as you weigh risk-benefit that you truly understand what the risk is. This is a brief list. It's by no means exhaustive. Again, I encourage you to come by our table and pick up some additional information and surf our website. And we're not the one and only website. We link out to the FDA, CDC. There are other similar organizations that provide this information. The important thing is inform yourself as you decide what you want to do. The next slide, I just kind of want to prepare you for. I'm using it by permission of the mom. And I'll tell you why I'm using it after you see it, but I just want you to know it's by permission.
Come on, you're okay, you're okay. Come on, baby, come on, babe, come on out. Come on, you're okay, come on, baby. Come on, baby, come on, babe. Come on, you can do it. Come on, babe, come on out. Come on, baby, come on. Keep breathing, come on, come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on.
That's actually a shortcut. That's 20 seconds of a vaccine reaction that went on much longer. That's a little baby seizure. Lauren had a seizure as a result of her DPT vaccine. In fact, she had multiple seizures and sustained permanent brain damage. Her family applied to the federally run Vaccine Injury Compensation Program and was awarded compensation. So when you read in the media that it's rare, as a parent who maybe has had to walk through that fire, that's your baby, doesn't matter how rare it is. I'm asking you to really educate yourself and wait, because that could happen to any of us. There is no way to know in advance before you have the vaccine. Your doctor or healthcare provider cannot tell you in advance if that vaccine is going to protect you, fail you, or harm you. And there are vaccine failures. We'll talk a little bit about that. So it's real. I show this not to shock you. I show it to humanize the issue, because as I see what happens in the public arena, it's too easy to say we're all numbers. We are all human beings. We all come to the table with different risks. and let's have a little respect for each other's information gathering, okay? That's Lauren at age 12 from a beauty pageant. She looks great there. Unfortunately, Lauren did suffer multiple seizures, as I said. She suffered permanent brain damage, and she died at the age of 15, okay? She was a successful applicant to the VICP. Karen Kane has written a book about it. It's a beautiful story. If you have a chance to ever meet Karen Kane, you should, and you should read the book. But it's something that affects the whole family, and compensation never makes this right. But it's good that she had the support. There are other injuries that happen as a result of vaccines, like arthritis, chronic nervous system dysfunction, seizure disorders, paralysis. When an injury is recognized in the medical literature in terms of the vaccine injury compensation program, it goes on to what's called the vaccine injury table. So some of these appear on the table, others go through a litigative process, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Obviously, your worst outcome is death, and it does happen, just like it happens with disease. You can also get a vaccine strain infection. There are vaccines that are what we call live virus vaccines. For example, varicella, or the chickenpox vaccine, shingles vaccine, and the MMR vaccine, or live virus vaccine. So it's possible, if you read the product insert, you could get a vaccine strain infection, meaning you could get shingles, you could get chickenpox. That doesn't mean that you're going to suffer a complication of the disease, but it's possible. So I hope what you're taking in from here is there's not a risk-free option. There's only your ability to decide what risk you're willing to take, okay? There's always the risk if you decide not to vaccinate that you're going to get the disease, that you could suffer a complication and indeed suffer a severe injury or even death, just as there is with the vaccine of suffering a complication, an injury, and death. There's not a risk-free option. So it's important that we do that critical analysis like we do with many things in our life. You've heard me mention informed consent a couple of times. How many people here actually know what it is? Okay, so a few actually recognize the term, but I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about why it's important. It's globally recognized as a human right, okay? It's no small thing. It's not just a term that we throw around casually. And the components, in a nutshell, of informed consent basically mean that you're doing that two sides of the coin risk assessment, that you have the risk information about whatever condition or disease you're seeking to not get, or that you have and you're seeking to treat, and you understand risk benefits. How often do complications occur with that disease? How severe are they? How often does the disease even happen in our population? You know, how disease unfolds in our country can look very different from how it unfolds in Africa, for example, okay? The same thing is true of vaccines, of course. You need to do that same information gathering, and that's what we really encourage, is that you make those informed decisions. Our mission is broad. We don't focus on one vaccine ingredient, or one adverse outcome. We're about you getting your information and making your decision. We have people who fully vaccinate, clear over to people who don't. We just want you to be making informed, voluntary decisions, and that's one of the key components of informed consent, is that it's voluntary. After you make your decision, it means there's no harassment or coercion, and no punishment. You shouldn't be fired from your job for refusing a vaccine. You shouldn't be barred from attending school, okay? We're seeing some of this happen. So let's talk a little bit about what the vaccine landscape looked like prior to the passage of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. Oh, it's a long phrase. You know, prior to the law, doctors did not have to inform you that there were risks associated with vaccines, and really that's what gave birth to our movement. Our co-founders felt very strongly that that is information they were entitled to. It may not have changed the decision, but they should have heard it. So there was no requirement for doctors or anyone who administered a vaccine. Today we have pharmacists administering vaccines. It's not just a doctor who does it. But there's no requirement to inform on risk. There was no requirement to record in the permanent medical record any adverse event that may have happened as a result of that. Detailed information about the vaccine itself, like the lot number and so on, wasn't required to be recorded into the permanent medical record. There was no centralized reporting system for adverse reactions, okay? let's see, obviously there was no compensation program, and there was no mandate for vaccine safety research, okay? The reason our co-founders worked with Congress to pass this law is because they were approached by pharmaceutical companies, that Congress was, after some lawsuits were filed against pharmaceutical companies, and a few made it through and won. And the pharmaceutical companies threatened to pull out and no longer make vaccines. And Congress felt it was their duty and obligation to secure the vaccine supply for America. Now, there weren't many lawsuits that were successful. In fact, many lost. Many parents were faced with settling for their children on courthouse steps. And, you know, they figured something was better than nothing. And when members of Congress approached our co-founders, what they were told was, we're going to do this. We're going to pass a liability shield for the pharmaceutical companies who produce vaccines. We have to secure the vaccine supply. And you can sit down and help us craft what compensation might look like. So they sat down. And we worked with good faith in Congress to create what we hoped and what we were promised was a no-fault, generous, expeditious compensation program. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's unfolded over time. But what our co-founders were able to secure were the safety, informing, recording, and reporting provisions that exist within the law. So how is the informing done? The informing is done through the vaccine information statements that the CDC put together. And in fact, I am MVIC's representative to the CDC's group that looks at any time this document is revised or updated. Okay, why are we involved? We're an organization of standing. They have to collaborate with organizations that are stakeholders or represent a population having to do with vaccines. And we have represented the vaccine injured and safety concerned and informed consent concerned for 35 years. I will tell you that over time, that this document has become extremely abbreviated, and that in 1993, the law was amended and struck very important components that used to appear here that did that more balancing risk assessment that we really wanted parents and individuals to have, you know, to really understand. For example, this used to have information and background about the disease, the severity of the disease, how often did complications occur. So what I would really encourage you to do is look deeper, because this document is not what it used to be. And at least for many of the parents that I deal with, it's not enough information for them either. This document is also not required to be discussed. So the federal requirement is simply that you receive it prior to vaccination. We do get reports that parents aren't receiving it or that they're receiving it after the fact. Okay? VAERS. This is the centralized adverse event reporting system that was created as a result of the passage of this law. It's co-administered by the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC. It's got big limitations, okay? It's what we call a passive system, which means that there are limitations in that there might be duplicate records in there or incomplete records. Primarily what the CDC uses it for is to detect safety signals. They have other things that they look at as well. I will tell you that our co-founders felt it was really important that there was a centralized system, and that also it was really important that you, as a consumer, were able to report reactions, because they were afraid that doctors wouldn't report them. And we do get those reports as well at MVIC. So this is actually a system that you have access to. If you were considering a vaccine, you could actually go in and search this database. There's a search engine that the CDC has called CDC Wonder. It's a little bulky, in my opinion. We have a volunteer, Dr. Steve Rubin, who has put together a program called Net Alerts, and it searches the program as well. But it's the same database, and you could search out how many reactions have happened in your state, for which vaccine, what are those reactions, okay? So that's a little bit about VAERS. I will tell you the other thing, because of its passivity, it's only estimated to capture between 1% and 10% of all vaccine reactions. So there was also a mandate for vaccine safety research, an ongoing mandate that as this nation pursues public health and sees vaccination as part of that program, that there's also an obligation to assure that we're getting safe vaccines, that they're as safe as possible. So there's a mandate for that. And for 25 years, the Institute of Medicine has reported on vaccines. They do what's called a systematic review, basically, and they review the medical literature, the breadth of it, and they grade it. And they make determinations on whether or not this vaccine over here causes this reaction or this condition. All right? When they come up with what's termed a causality statement, it goes on the vaccine injury table that's used in the compensation program. It's not quite as simple as that, but I'm giving you the mile-high overview. I will tell you that since they've been doing the reports, and who here is familiar with the Institute of Medicine? Okay, so most people. So let me tell you who they are first, because then you can kind of appreciate the work they do. The Institute of Medicine is part of the National Academies of Science, and the National Academies of Science was created under Abraham Lincoln's administration, and their job is basically answering the tough science questions of the day for our nation. And the Institutes of Medicine is an arm of the National Academies of Science, and it was created in the 1970s. And this is one of their roles. They put out many reports. This is just, these are reports that are of concern to us because they pertain to our mission. I will tell you that, as I said, since they've been reporting, one of the common themes throughout all their reports on vaccines and whether or not they cause harm, when they grade the evidence, and they look at both at epidemiological evidence and they look at bench science, okay, they don't just look at epidemiology, and they do a balancing act. And they determine things like, gosh, is that a really good study? Was it constructed well? Did it ask the right questions? Was the conclusion overreaching? You know, so they don't just take the conclusion, they take an in-depth look at the literature. And for all reports, excluding their 2011-2012 report, for 60% of what they had looked at, there was inadequate evidence to decide one way or another if the reaction or condition that they were investigating in association with the vaccine was actually caused by the vaccine. Their biggest review was in that 2011-2012 timeframe. They looked at 158 of the most commonly reported vaccine adverse events for 8 or 9 routinely recommended vaccines for children, and for 85%, and that's over 130 of those adverse reactions that they looked at, there was either an absence of science or a lack of quality science that prevented them from making the determination on whether or not this vaccine caused this condition over here. Why am I telling you this? I know it's a lot of numbers, and you're going, why do I care? You should care because what have you all heard in the media? The science is done. Have we all heard that? Science is done. Does that sound like the science is done to you? Yeah. There's either an absence of science, which means there's really none, or the science that exists is not of high quality. When they, remember I said they grade the science? That's exactly it. And write down your questions. I'm really happy to answer them at the end, but yes, you nailed it. That's exactly what it says, and what that means is we have some pretty serious vaccine safety research deficits. And what I would also say to you is, for me, and for many people that I deal with, it's kind of unfathomable that we would ever say the science is done on anything. Science evolves. Science is never done. Science is like, you got to be curious. We're always asking questions. What we thought we knew 30 years ago about any science question has probably changed over time because we have great researchers that continue to ask these really important questions, and we learn more, and we might have to shift what we know because we just figured something new out. So again, it's important to ask questions, whether you're in the research field or just as a consumer. It makes us better, savvy people. We understand the world around us better. We're able to make better decisions based on who we are as individuals. So that's why the IOM is important, okay? And that's why their findings are important. And it would take you about 5 minutes to look through a causality table and realize, go fact check me, please do. Go out there to the IOM's website, go pull up a causality table, and you'll see inadequate, inadequate, inadequate. And they define inadequate. They define inadequate by saying it doesn't mean yes or no, it means we don't know. We don't have enough information to tell you if this is true or not. Now, when they do have a positive finding, it's forwarded to the Federal Advisory Committee that oversees, and there's recommendations made on whether or not to add it to the table of injuries so that your injury claim can be processed more quickly. There was also another study done, or review done in 2012, and it actually had to do with the childhood schedule itself. You remember we talked about the different concerns, both on the number of vaccines given in any single time, as well as just the sheer breadth of what we call the recommended schedule now. And the key findings from that were that the schedule really hasn't been fully studied. Okay? When vaccines go through trials, they might be compared or tested against a few other vaccines, but the schedule itself has never been fully tested. Okay? And that's often missed by the media. Healthcare professionals, these are the people we go to ask questions, and yet the IOM found that they don't have a lot of information to give you as a consumer on is it safe and effective to give so many vaccines in a single visit, as we now see on the recommended schedule. So what I would say is these are legitimate concerns that parents are voicing. The IOM is saying, indeed, that the full schedule hasn't been systematically studied, and there's not a lot of information for healthcare professionals to rely on. There's also little data on whether or not the recommended schedule created by the CDC is actually the safest and best. When we buy a car or an appliance, are we getting the best product for the best bang for the buck? Parents have those same questions. They want to know, is this the safest, effective schedule out there? Is this the schedule I should be following? We are contacted by the public who, if they're worried about the breadth of the schedule, very often a parent will space out the vaccines. Most people vaccinate. They may opt out of, say, varicella vaccine or HPV vaccine, but most people are vaccinating, but they may not be vaccinating according to the recommended schedule because maybe their child had a reaction and they want to space it out and limit the possibility of that. Okay? It doesn't mean they're not vaccinating, but depending on how research might be constructed, they might fall into the unvaccinated group. So I would tell you there may be shades of gray when you hear that term. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program because we've been dabbling on the edges of it. This was the safety net that we worked in good faith, our co-founders worked in good faith to help create for the public. Unfortunately, when you hear about it now, it's put in terms of this took away your right to sue. It didn't. It actually preserved it. What our co-founders worked for, and mind you, not everything's in your control when you're sitting down at a table and working with Congress. There's lots of back and forth. What our co-founders were able to secure in the law and preserve in the law, that you first had to go through the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. If you thought you had sustained an injury, you must go through that program first. If you were not satisfied with the outcome of what came from that process, then you could sue. Okay, in a nutshell. So some of the problems it's created is there have been reports commissioned by the federal government that show the public has a very low awareness of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. How many here are even aware of it today? Oh, that's really nice. I'll tell you that you're outliers. Most people aren't even aware of this program. They're not aware of VAERS or that they could submit a report. They aren't aware that this program has what we call a statute of limitations, which means if you've incurred an injury, that time clock's running. And if you don't apply for compensation within that time frame, you're not eligible again. There's no do-over. Okay? Now, this program has awarded over $3.5 billion to over 5,000 families and individuals who've either had an injury or even died as a result of a vaccine adverse event. But I would also tell you, 2/3 of claims are dismissed. About 95% or more go through what we call this litigative risk process. And what that means, you remember when I told you about the vaccine injury table and how when the Institute of Medicine is able to determine causality, it's considered and put onto the vaccine injury table. So if you went out to HRSA's website, you would see this table saying measles can cause febrile seizures. Okay, so if that's what your claim was about, theoretically your claim should process quickly. There shouldn't be a lot of argument. That's not what's happening, because we have these safety deficits, which means that if you file a petition and it's not on the table, you have to prove it. You got to go find a medical expert, and basically you're having to prove your case. That is not what we were promised. That is not a generous, expeditious, efficient delivery system. And by the way, when you see it's called a court in a paper, this was never, ever designed to be a court. It does not run like a court. There's no subpoena power. There's no discovery. Okay? This was always meant to be an administrative process that was expeditious, no fault, generous to the claimants, quick. There are people who have waited 10 years in this program to get compensated and over. Okay? We don't even know how many people don't even get as far as filing a claim, because if you're past the statute of limitations, you never even get a petition in the system. So I guess my point is that the system has not been implemented as it was promised. There's been a breach of trust when our co-founders sat down in good faith, and it sorely needs improvement. To make matters worse, in 2011, your right to sue actually was taken away, but it wasn't taken away by this law. It was taken away by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court handed down a ruling that effectively said, you don't get to sue even if the manufacturer could make a better, safer vaccine. Outside of how galling that is for you as a citizen, what it also does is it incentivizes the industry to produce the safest product possible. They don't have to. There's no skin in the game. And I just think it's something to be aware of. Let's talk a little bit about California state law and how California works. Again, I want to remind you, visit our website at mvic.org. If you're not from California and you're curious about what vaccine requirements look like in your state and what exemptions are offered. Here in California, until 2015, you had the right to exercise your informed consent rights around personal belief exemption, which also kind of encompassed religious beliefs. Governor Brown signed SB 277, and unless you already had, and this did not affect college students, it affected pre-K and K through 12, unless you already had a personal belief exemption in place prior to January of 2016, you couldn't be grandfathered in. So in real terms, you have a second grader. You have a personal belief exemption. Your second grader transfers from grade school over to middle school. You are no longer eligible. You just lost it. Now you only have medical exemption. Okay? This is a violation of human rights. This is a procedure that you're being asked to do that could cause harm, and no one can tell you in advance. And that's the problem with this. It's a human rights violation. There's also another law passed in 2015 that required that daycare workers and parent volunteers in daycare receive measles, pertussis, and influenza vaccines. There is a personal belief exemption available for influenza vaccine. If you get a titer test, you can prove that you have titers for measles and pertussis. You don't have to get the vaccine, or you can show proof of being vaccinated. And I guess you would lose your job if you didn't comply. There was also another law passed in 2011 here in California that a 12-year-old, a minor, 12 years old and up, can give consent to be vaccinated without parental knowledge. Okay? There are a couple of really big issues with that. Number one, parents have historically been the decision makers in medical procedures that their children might be faced with, right? Why is that? Mostly because kids at that age can't really do those two sides of the coin. They can't appreciate, what risk looks like. So there's that concern just from the developmental stage. There's also the concern of, if that were to happen and your child did have a complication resulting from the vaccine, how would you as a parent know that? If you're zipping into the ER room and you got to talk to that ER physician, you don't know. You don't have that piece of critical information to give to that healthcare provider. It also means you would never know that you could apply for compensation if your child did indeed have an outcome where it was actually an injury. Okay? So from a policy standpoint, MVIC doesn't support that. We think parents are the best decision makers for their children. The reality here for parents in California is, as you talk to your children about sex, I assume those talks happen, you might want to scoop up that. They're probably going to be approached by a school official or healthcare provider in the school setting and asked, and what is your plan? It's your decision to make. I'm just saying from an awareness standpoint, that might be something you have to work into all those conversations we have as parents with our kids as we prepare them for their lives outside the school and as they leave our home. All right. So what I just want to offer to you is information resources. We are not the only stop. There are so many people putting out good information. We're here today at in the exhibitor fair. We have our Mythbusters. We have our law and reform guide. There's a lot of information if you want to educate yourself and kind of do that risk assessment. We write original articles. We reference them. You can click through and see, why are we making the statements we're making? They're not just opinion. We're basing it on medical literature. We're basing it on maybe what we're seeing in policy making in other countries. I hope you'll read them. I hope you'll take advantage of some of our downloadable information. We also link out to the FDA so that you can read the vaccine manufacturer's product insert. What is that? When you go to Walgreens and you pick up your prescription and they staple on that piece of paper that lists all the do's and don'ts and tell you about the drug? Well, there's that for vaccines too, and it's kept on the FDA's website. So if you have certain ingredients that in pharmacopoeia you're allergic to that might be present in a vaccine, you could read about that in the product insert. It's a more detailed description of the vaccine itself, some of what they found in the clinical trials, the known side effects, okay? So it's a good source of information, and we link out to that. We also link out, of course, to the vaccine information statements on our website. We link to the Pink Book, which I think is a pretty good resource. It gives you the background on diseases as well as the vaccine and the history of both. We also, of course, keep our links to the IOM reports, which we think are really important in terms of understanding that there are a lot of unknown risks. And of course, you can call us. We have counselors. If you think you've sustained a vaccine injury or had a reaction, we can help you plug into VAERS if you want to make a report, or if you were trying to search it, we can help you out. We can also help you with finding resources for filing a claim within the VICP. So I guess the bottom line here is it's your decision to make. And I hope that you'll take the time to educate yourself as you make it. I also hope that if you're concerned about the erosion of parental rights and human rights around this, it's not about whether or not you vaccinate. I'll tell you, we were fighting a nasty bill in my state of Colorado, and I had a woman walk up to me and she goes, I fully vaccinate my children. I'm like, okay. She goes, and I am appalled that somebody is going to tell me what I can do. She got it. It wasn't about, are you doing it or not doing it? It's about, do you want the right to decide what risk you're being asked to take? Like I said, this is a human rights issue. So educate yourselves. If the erosion of rights here in California bothers you, I hope that you also consider getting active and talking to your legislator, because this kind of law is made at the state level, and that's what your state legislator can influence. Many are using our law and reform guide as an educating tool, not only for themselves, but for their educators, or for their legislators. And we do have some with us today. You can also download it on our website. It's got over 240 live links to research and expertise. So I encourage you to click through, read it, see why we're saying what we're saying. We have 3 websites. MVAC.org keeps information on vaccines and diseases. And as I said, has many links to other resources for you to continue your journey of information gathering. We also have the MVIC advocacy portal. We launched that in 2010 because we started seeing a lot of legislation introduced to restrict your human rights. We'd like to obviously see your human rights here in California restored. We also have Terry Rourke. Terry, please raise your hand. Terry is our California advocacy director and works with many of our California parents. I'll tell you, when SB 277 was passed, you were only a few votes short from defeating it. And the most effective way to take care of this is to work with your legislators and roll back that law. Okay? And whether or not you take this on or you become active, I just hope that you'll appreciate. I used to live overseas. I've lived in the Middle East, and I really started to appreciate the freedoms I had here. your legislators want to hear from you. This is part of our democracy. Whatever you're talking about. Let's just take our hat off and not even talk about vaccines. If these people you're electing are representing you, and if you don't like how they're representing you, you've got to talk to them, and it's not hard. I never thought I would do that. It seems really scary, but it's happening. People are doing it. They care about a lot of different things. If you're not talking to them, they don't know what you want, they can't represent you, and what they're hearing is whatever the lobbyist is saying. Somebody who's paid to put forward a view. Okay? So I would just encourage you to take advantage of our democracy. We also have the vaccine reaction. It's like a newspaper. It gives you kind of that daily overview of what's happening on the vaccine landscape. So I encourage you to come out. You can sign up for that. It's all free. It's part of our service to the public of education. So I hope that you'll just start digging. Be curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And think about your human rights. Substitute a different word for vaccines for a different pharmaceutical product or medical procedure, and ask yourself, do you want somebody else making that risk decision for you, or is that something that's your right? As I said, MVIC is not for or against vaccines. We never have been, although I get really entertained by both sides being accused of being, we're for vaccines and we're against. I will defend to the ground your right to vaccinate or not vaccinate. It's your right, and I fight for you every day. Everybody in MVIC does. Think about it. So thank you. It's your turn. There's a mic there, and we are being filmed, so I hope that, please speak clearly and succinctly and shortly, because I'm not sure how much time we have left.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and it explains some things I didn't know before. And so I have two quick questions.
Sure.
Am I understanding that when they passed the law for this vaccine injury court, at that
process,
time...
please. It's a process. It's not a court.
A process, okay. At that time, you still had the right to sue if you'd exhausted all your remedies in that process?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, but that was changed.
It was an alternative to a lawsuit. And if you didn't like the outcome of what came out of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program,
you could still sue.
Mm-hmm.
And that was changed in 2011 with the Supreme Court decision.
The Supreme Court ruling has effectively taken that away from me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my second question has to do with paying for these injuries, paying for the injuries, which comes from a tax on the vaccines.
Right, it's a surcharge.
A surcharge on the vaccine, and my understanding is that nobody knows how much is in that pot of money.
Actually, you can go to HRSA's website, okay? They're the entity that oversees, or that the VICP falls directly under, and they do issue a trust report. There's an advisory commission that was created by the law called the Advisory Commission on Childhood Vaccines. It's one of the federal advisory committees I monitor. And every meeting, they actually present how much money's in the trust fund, it's invested, how much has it earned, what is the principal. So actually that information is available.
So can you say again where that is?
It's on, I'll give you just an easy keyword search, okay?
Okay.
Just put in Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, Trust Fund, and it should take you to HRSA's webpage, and you should be able to. HRSA, it's a agency within the government, the federal government. What is it? Human Resource Service Administration.
Can you just spell that out, please?
I'm sorry, I do alphabet soup. It's Human Resource Services Administration, I believe is what that one means.
Okay. So we do know how much is there.
Yeah.
Because the suspicion is that this is a real money-making thing for the government.
Okay, so the trust fund is kept in trust. I will tell you that there have been attempts, the gaps in research. The ACCV, which is the Federal Advisory Commission that makes recommendations to the Secretary of Health on, what they think would make the program run better. It's reported, they've been asked to say, hey, let's use that to close those gaps. And every time they say that, I get off the phone and I say, nope, that is not what that trust fund was for. That trust fund was strictly for compensating those who are injured. Go get your money from Congress to do that.
So do we know how much is in there?
I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. I know that It's probably getting close to 4 billion. I'm going to guess it's right around 3.5 as well, 3.5 billion. It's going to be in between 3.5 billion and 4 billion.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I don't have that exact number.
Hi, my name is Marcella. I'm the mother of 2 vaccine-injured boys, the youngest, very severe. Anyway, did the U.S. sign the Nuremberg Code?
Did the U.S. sign the Nuremberg Code? I believe they did.
Well, then, if we don't get cooperation from the Supreme Court, why doesn't someone go? Who's in charge of implementation of the Nuremberg Code? And could you also comment on SB 18? And, go ahead.
Well, so who knows what the Nuremberg Code is?
It was after World War II.
Okay, so it's after World War II, and it was because of the human violations on people in the concentration camps, experimentation without their permission. That the informed consent ethic has been the cornerstone of the practice of ethical practice of modern medicine, and a lot of this comes out of the Nuremberg Code because of the experimentations that happened during the war, and the world got together and said, "We're voting. We shouldn't be doing that." There are other declarations, like the Declaration of Helsinki, I believe. So there are other declarations, and what you're really asking is, why is this happening? Because we've signed on to these, and this is a human right. I would just say that there's also the pressure of public health. Many see this as a public health issue. And what I would say is, you know, public health serves a purpose, but it can't be at the expense of the human right. And I think we have to have a really critical look at you know, is there an emergency? There is not a public health emergency here in America that should even have us entertaining violating this human right. It's precious. And like anything, I think we're going to have to fight for it. I know that's not what you want to hear. There's not a quick and easy answer, but that's going to be the nutshell answer I give you today.
And
18, come back to our table and Terry can talk to you more about 18.
And how about the adult schedule that's supposed to be fully implemented by 2020? This is supposed to be the decade of vaccines.
You're talking about the Healthy People 2020 goals. Right. So the Healthy People 2020 goals are aspirational goals. I will tell you, I personally have some fears that we'll see those goals, and they aren't just vaccine goals, they're public health goals, that we'll see mandates. Like I said, if you substitute the word vaccine for something else, ask yourself if you're willing to give your right to decide away on what risks you want to take with your health. So they're supposed to be aspirational. They're not supposed to have any ties to mandates, but you know, we're seeing this with vaccines, and you know, I just think that it's a slippery slope when you start talking about, hey, I'm willing to compromise a human right. There are laws if we're hit by a pandemic where there might be other considerations. They are in place, so I don't think this should be an everyday, let's just give up our human rights for this. And that is the stance that we take at MVIC. And it's going to be up to all of us to defend our rights. This is part of our democracy.
Thank you very much for your talk and coming here. My name is Nori. I'm a nutrition professional. I've been following some of the work of Mark and David Geyer, who have been continuing on their own dollar, researching a data set that the CDC allowed them to have access to.
The VSD.
And one of the things that they've come up with is that the lead time from vaccine to overt injury is quite short, according to the definition for this compensation program. I'm wondering if the NVIC is doing any advocacy work in extending that so that beyond 3 years you might see neurological damage from injury occurring even though it's not overt at the time of vaccination.
I'd agree that for a lot of what you're seeing on the vaccine injury table, those time frames are short. They are defined by the evidence base that's used. And some of how that's guided is written into the statute. We have done years of advocacy work and being pretty critical of how this system is rolled out. We're not happy. This was not what we intended. It is not what we were promised. Yes, we'd like to see it change. We actually were approached by the Government Accountability Office a few years ago to give our perspective on, they had a charge from the House Oversight Committee on the VICP. So we were asked some very specific questions about, did we think the program was successful? What were our concerns? And some of our concerns are the same that you just voiced. And What we really need and what we've supported things like having an independent safety and oversight body similar to the NTSB. You can't have the government doing everything from the creation to the distribution and safety oversight and do an objective job. That's why we have the NTSB. We need a similar organization that does the safety and oversight to make sure that those conflicts of interest aren't there in our vaccine system. Number two, we have long advocated for the need of a prospective study comparing health outcomes among the vaccinated and unvaccinated, so that we can understand the mechanisms of injury and what are the time frames. When you look at the vaccine safety deficits out of the IOM, you also have to, your question is reasonable. Do we really have a good understanding of those time frames that they've set on the VIT? So, we give our input pretty regularly. It's going to take more than us. It's going to take people also giving their input. If it's important to you, make your voice heard. These federal advisory committees that I monitor and I comment on, they're open for your comment. You can hop on the phone and give them a comment. We give people notice when there's something in the Federal Register that maybe you want to chime in on. I'm going to make this the last one because I want to be respectful of our next speaker. And I'm hoping we're not over.
Hi, my name's Denise. I understand that when you sign documents when you are admitted to the hospital, that there's a word called biologics in there. And I'm hearing more and more that people are being injected with the flu vaccine when they are admitted to a hospital, whether or not they even are aware of it. Can you speak to what a consumer can do, what a person can do when they're signing those documents to make sure that they're not injected with a vaccine without their awareness?
Okay, so you're talking about standing orders and standard of care, and it's become something that is being recommended at a federal level that your healthcare facilities do. For example, if you're pregnant and you're having your child in a hospital, you may have signed an agreement unknowingly for hepatitis B vaccine at birth, okay? Or you might be signing something saying that if you're hospitalized and your record isn't showing that you've had an influenza vaccine, that you get one, and they don't necessarily say, hey, by the way, this is a vaccine. So I'm going to give you the same advice my parents gave me as I became a young adult. Read what you're signing. Now, that's really fine print, and it's pages long, and, if you're in an ER visit, you don't really, the time criticality may not be, the priority may not be reading those pieces of paper. So what I would say to you is check in with your physicians at the very beginning on, do they have these kinds of orders, and write in on what you're signing, in the initial what you write in, that you want informed consent for anything that's a standing order in there. So that if this order says, if your record shows you haven't been vaccinated for flu vaccine, you'd like to know what's happening. You don't want to just be injected. That's your best recourse. Get a copy of it. Have it with you when a doctor or anyone approaches you. You're going to have to be inquisitive and find out because, it exists. So thank you. I'm going to be out there if you have more questions because I want to be respectful.